name is Sam Franklin and I'm an assistant head teacher at Long Stratton High School, and I'm also an ELE with the Norwich Research School. And today we're going to be discussing whole school assessment. I'm going to start by looking back at some assessment practices which were in place in my own school before we made any changes. And you'll recognise many of these maybe from your own school or previous schools, and they are widely used in many schools still. We're then going to consider the research and evidence surrounding some of these practices and really try and think deeply about their level of efficiency and how right they are for the purposes that we want to get out of our assessment system. And I'm also going to add in my own experiences of these whilst leading whole school assessment. And this is then going to form the basis of the rationale for the changes that I made to our own assessment system within my school, and give you an alternative way in which you can design your assessment system if you would like to. Now, this is not a perfect model by any means. It doesn't aim to be the correct way of doing things at all, but I hope that it will allow you to challenge the existing assessment practices in your own school and show that you can take a big step forward into letting go of some of those practices which we might be feeling are less effective. It also hopefully will give you a model that you could choose to use if you think it's appropriate for your context, and I can talk you through the process of not only implementing that model specifically, but things to consider if you were to implement any kind of change to a whole school assessment system. And I'm really going to talk you through the pros and cons of the changes that we made, the bumps in the road, the lessons learned, and offer hopefully some guidance and support for anybody who is looking at making some of those changes within your own school. So to begin with, I just want to show you this slide, because the change to the assessment system at whole school level was part of a much wider change related to assessment within the school. And I haven't got time today to talk about all of those different elements, but it is important to say that it wasn't a case that we just changed the framework and that was everything solved. Not only are there areas to improve within the system itself still, it also relied on the feeding in of all of these different areas. So improving assessment design in general, and also expanding our toolbox for responsive teaching. So none of this happened on its own, but today in this talk we'll be looking at the system framework specifically. So this is the system that was in place before we made any changes, and at the centre of this is the idea of a flight path tracking system, and many of you will still be familiar with this either within your own schools or from previous assessment systems that you might have worked within. And if you're not sure about what we mean by a flight path, I just want to show you these two slides quickly. We have here an example in the left-hand corner of what the flight path looked like within my own school. And this is based on the assumption that the GCSE target grade of a pupil, so you can see here where we've got 7s, for example, can be used as an anchor point to then work backwards throughout all of the year groups and all of the key stages to map out almost mini targets at each stage as to where they should be if they are going to reach that said target of, say, 7. So it developed into a process where departments had spreadsheets like this, where they were mapping each of those incremental steps towards the target that that pupil was supposed to achieve at the end of their key stage. And you'll also see how that is then reported in our school in relation to that incremental progress that's supposed to have been made. So where pupils were making the correct amount of progress at each data point, they would receive an expected, and then there was a judgment made about whether they were below or well below, above or well above, based on where that data said they should be. Now, there are lots of flaws in this system anyway, which we'll explore in greater detail, but even on the surface of this, I can talk about experience of having different subjects, having different thresholds for basically how far away from any one point you should be, whilst you can still maintain expected or above or well below. So what the difference between those thresholds were varied massively between subjects, as well as thinking about actually the flaws of this system in the first place. I think it's also important to have this quote out here really early on, because a lot of the driving force behind people using these flight path systems was around the need to track and monitor and to show progress for the benefits of SLT or governors and the trusts that you might work within, but also for Ofsted if they showed up. And we made the changes to our assessment system before the new Ofsted framework came out. It's worth highlighting, but there are now quotes out there like this one from 2019, which makes it very clear that not only are they not expecting a flight path system to be in place, but actually that it can be demotivating for pupils, which we'll talk more about as we go through these slides. So we're going back to what we had before, and as you can see, we've got 6 data entry points a year, and then a flight path system based on GCSE target grades given to pupils from year 7 right through to year 11, setting GCSE style assessment papers and questions, and using GCSE grading on any pieces of work that were assessed. So a year 7 would be told they'd completed their work to a standard of a 3, for example. And this caused many issues, but the initial reasons that I wanted to look into changes to the assessment system were based on the high level of workload that it was generating for our staff, and we could see the impact that was having on them in terms of their well-being and managing their workload in other areas. Also from listening to them as part of our line management or our just general staff conversations around the strain that it was putting on them. Also around the blurred lines between summative and formative assessment. I'll talk more about this later, but we basically were using assessments summatively, but claiming that they were formative. And yet we were not really in a position to embed any changes or lessons learned from any summative assessments because we were so quickly turning around to the next data point. We also had a curriculum that was driven by the data points, which we'll explore later, but really rushing to get content done in order to assess it, which is not what we'd want from our system. And from my point of view, in terms of my role being in charge of outcomes, so tracking and monitoring is a big part of that, I was spending a lot of time on actions based upon inferences made from meaningless data, or at least data that was not truly meaningful and useful to me. So I needed to change it. Now, these are the key changes that we made, and I'll go through each individually, but this kind of summarizes the main changes. And really, it's about removing those elements that I thought were unhelpful and were actually acting as some kind of barrier to learning, as well as not necessarily being fit for purpose. So this quote is a really good place to start, and it talks about the fact that we want assessment to be fit for purpose so that it generates meaningful and useful data. And the idea is that we should be able to generate information which allows us to take actions which help to improve student outcomes overall. And that might be at classroom level, but I'm talking here more about whole school level identification of patterns and trends that we can then act upon. So when we think about purpose really in a clear way, there are some key questions that we need to ask ourselves. And for me, this turning point came taking part in the Assessment Leads programme from Evidence-Based Education, where the 4 pillars of assessment in the top right-hand corner are from. And they really helped to challenge me to think about the purpose of the assessments that we were putting in place. So thinking about questions like, why are we doing this assessment? What do we actually aim to get out of it? Who is the assessment for? And the overarching question really being, how will we use the information generated from this process? And when we sat down and really thought about it, it became evident that actually the purpose behind the assessment wasn't necessarily exactly what we thought it was or we intended it to be initially. So today I'm going to be talking about summative internal assessment, and by that I mean information about the level of learning that has taken place up until a certain point. And that is really important to think about in terms of the purpose for other people who want that information. So pupils, in order to give them an idea of how well they did on a topic or a unit or a paper, to report that to parents and carers. for teachers to deal with at a classroom level or maybe a departmental level, and also to report on to SLT and governors. And it's really important to bear this in mind when we're thinking about purpose. So in reality, I think we're in a situation where we're living in a false sense of security, because the system itself seemed to tie up very well. We entered the data, it created patterns to do with progress, and we had this very clear, logical steps towards their end of year 11, Key Stage 4 target grade. And unfortunately, because all of those elements seemed to work together so smoothly, we operated under the illusion that actually we had a purposeful, meaningful process. I think there was also a lot of safety, a feeling of safety that comes from working within a continuous model. So if we can say we need them to end up here at a 7, and we can track back those logical steps throughout all of those stages of year 7, year 8, year 9, year 10, that gives us a real sense of safety that we're on the right track and we're heading towards somewhere where we need to be. But really, what I think this actually led to was an overconfidence in the quality of the inferences that were being made about the data. So throughout this presentation, I'm going to talk in terms of meaningful and useful data as much as possible. We could talk about reliability and validity, for example, which are in parts of the 4 pillars of assessment. But again, that's a whole nother topic to explore and to unpick. So we're going to talk in terms of meaningful and useful. And unfortunately, the data we were generating wasn't necessarily either of those things. So the first thing that we did was to remove data points, and we went from 6 data points to 3. And we did this based on a number of factors. As I said, we had communicated with staff in a number of ways and got feedback about the strain that they were under to maintain that system. And they were also very clear in raising the opportunity costs of doing this continuous cycle of assessing and feeding back. And by opportunity costs, I simply mean that by doing that, investing time in lessons to sit the tests, and then in their own time to mark the tests, and then time feeding back to the pupils and expecting responses from the pupils to that feedback, there was a huge amount of time that was being used up that could be used elsewhere. And we were in the process, as I alluded to in one of the first slides, of making other changes to the assessment systems themselves, upskilling in methods of formative assessment, for example, and looking at assessment design. And so it became apparent to me that we could utilise this time much more effectively to make more meaningful and useful data if we weren't expecting them to be in this continuous cycle of summative assessment. And also, we should be mindful of feedback from papers such as the Making Data Work Teacher Workload Advisory Group, which made it clear that there is no evidence that increased assessment frequency directly increases the outcomes. There is no evidence for that. And they go so far as to say that actually having any more than 2 or 3 attainment data collection points a year there is really no reason for that. And I think that's extremely, it's blunt, it's there for us to see. So even by moving from 6 to 3, we're still at the top end of that, but it was a change and a step in the right direction. So that's where I got that anchor of 3 data points from initially. And we also needed to consider the idea of performance versus learning. So when we think of testing or assessment, what we want to get out of that is some kind of indication of the level of learning that has taken place. Now, we can never directly assess learning per se. We can only rely on the performance within that assessment to give us an indication about the level of learning that has taken place. However, we need to be really mindful of the differences between learning and performance. So when we talk about performance, we are talking about the ability to potentially recall information or apply knowledge and skills that we've just learned. Now, that might be at the end of a unit or a topic, or it might be because you've revised the lesson before. Performance does not mean the same thing as learning. Learning is specifically a change in the long-term memory. So in order for learning to have taken place, we need to be able to revisit that over a period of time and still be able to apply that knowledge, that skills. And that's when we know that learning has taken place as opposed to performance. So we really need to be mindful, first of all, of the terminology there, but secondly, that what we are getting out of those assessments does not just indicate how well they can perform on that assessment when it is relatively fresh in their minds, which was happening a lot when we had 6 very frequent data points. We instead wanted to think about, okay, they studied this topic previously and hopefully they've revisited that topic over a period of time, and can they now, much further away from when they initially learnt that those knowledge or those skills, can they still apply, and has true learning taken place? And that is really important when we're looking at whether the data is meaningful or not. So increases in performance can occur with no increase in the long-term learning, which I've just talked about, but actually as well, Dylan William goes on to say, increases in performance on a learning task can actually be accompanied by a reduction in long-term learning. And there are a number of reasons for this, and I'd recommend that you look into this reference. But one of the ideas is potentially whether pupils think, okay, I studied a topic, I did a test on that topic, I got a good score on that topic, I've learnt it, I'm done. And then they don't think that that is something that they need to continue to work on any longer. So when they're tested on that, maybe 6 months down the line, they suddenly find that although they could perform on that assessment at that moment in time, the learning, the long-term changes to memory or changes to long-term memory haven't necessarily taken place. And that's one of those reasons that we see that. And it's also important to think about the autonomy that having less data points gives to the assessment cycle in itself. So again, here I'm expanding that to mean not just summative assessments, but more importantly, the formative assessments. So by having 3 data points, that data entry can account for a range of assessments that may have been done formatively and more casually, as it were, in lessons, that dialogue with pupils, that interaction with pupils on a lesson-to-lesson basis, as opposed to in a formal assessment. That can all feed into a data point, and it also frees up time, like I talked about earlier, to actually implement and embed some of those formative assessment practices. Lastly, in terms of the data points, it also allows a wider breadth of domains to be included. So when we are giving something a grade, and when we are assessing something, particularly summatively, we need to be mindful of the role in that grade as being representative of what they have learned overall. If we are assessing many times over a very frequent system, then we can only actually look at a very narrow domain of learning, and therefore assess across a narrow range of things that we want them to be assessed on. So by giving way from 6 data points to 3 data points, we actually increase not only the time through which pupils need to continue to consolidate that knowledge in order to learn, but we also allow a greater number of elements to be introduced to that assessment, to test them across a greater range of domains. And that is going to give us more meaningful data about how they are getting on in that subject, as opposed to extrapolating how well they are doing in English based on one English question, for example. So it helps to make the data more meaningful and therefore more useful. And I strongly recommend anyone who wants to think more about the difference between performance and learning, and also breadth of domains, to look at Damien Benny's Research Ed presentation, which is referenced at the bottom there. So to summarise that section, it's really about making sure that we are trying to get the most sound information that we can, the most meaningful and the most useful, because assessment processes, we know, show less consistent patterns purely as a chance of measurement error, if nothing else. And so if we're striving to constantly see these linear patterns of progress on the frequency of 6 data points, we are going to have an issue with doing that. And if we are managing to create data that looks that way, I would also argue that we need to look more closely at that data to see how we're arriving at that point, because the reality is assessment is messy, learning is messy, and it doesn't work in a linear way. So we need to be challenging ourselves if we are firstly aiming for that, and secondly, if we think we have already reached that stage. We also had conversations about the time. I've already mentioned about time performative assessment, but it also increased the amount of time that people could spend on delivering the curriculum in a different way. We moved away from curriculum being driven by data points. So, for example, we had a situation in English where pupils were being assessed on Jekyll and Hyde before they had finished Jekyll and Hyde, which meant that automatically narrowed the types of questions that they could be asked. And also, we then extrapolated that to make the basis of a judgment on how good they were at Jekyll and Hyde. So it was a self-perpetuating cycle of creating less meaningful and less useful data. So rather than rush to get the pupils in a position to be able to complete an assessment on something that they've been studying, we now have more time to put assessments in at appropriate times for the curriculum, as opposed to just a timetabled session that everyone else needs to work towards. And it comes back to this idea from Tom Rees saying about spacing out the data points really does free up precious time, which we can be better spending elsewhere. So in terms of planning and implementing this change, as I talked about, we use staff feedback and meeting minutes and line management meetings to really get an idea about the issues that they were facing. And when we then sat down to think about how we could change it, I was very clear about putting a rationale in place that was heavily evidence informed, which is how I got into exploring lots of these areas anyway. And in order to make sure that I was in the best position to persuade various stakeholders that there was a need to change the assessment system, I wrote a proposal, and I'll be happy to share this proposal with anyone who'd like to see it. But effectively, what I'm going to do now is explain to you the rationale that I used to convince the governors and the trust that this was a sensible move to make, and talk you through that rationale. Now, within the proposal, I was sure to mitigate concerns that I could predict would be outlined, and try and make sure that those had been addressed before the proposal was submitted. And also using some of the quotes or papers or research that Ofsted and the DfE themselves were using, because whilst many of the anxieties around needing to have a tracking and monitoring system that work towards incremental progress steps towards that 7 at the end of year 11, for example, that anxiety was often based in the feeling that that was needed for reporting up, so as far up as Ofsted. So actually the research on workload from Ofsted and ways of being mindful of that, as well as some of the things I've already shared with you about the number of data points, and actually the removal of looking at internal tracking data, was really, really powerful in helping me to persuade people that this was the time to make a bigger change, and we had the space and the time to really rewrite what we were doing. And throughout all of this, I used the EEF's guide to implementation, which is an excellent guide for any school change that you want to make, no matter what that project is, but was definitely an anchor for me as I was moving through this system. So this was really important for me. I won't spend loads of time on it, but it just goes back to the idea of Ofsted explicitly saying that we need to be mindful of workload. We shouldn't be having more than 2 or 3 data collection points, and actually the time put into data tracking and monitoring and collection needs to be worth it. And that was a real linchpin in my argument. Within that proposal, it also included the removal of GCSE target grades, which I showed you at the start. And this was really based around the false certainty that surrounds target grades. There are a number of reasons why target grades are flawed. And it's important that we at the very least understand that and talk openly about that, whether you choose to use target grades or not. So firstly, the fact that they are based on Key Stage 2 English and Maths is, again, straight away an issue when we are then applying that to a range of subjects which require a range of knowledge and skills that may or may not touch upon those skills that were assessed effectively at Key Stage 2. So there's already an inherent issue with that target grade already. We then need to think about the fact that the assessments themselves, as any kind of assessment is, will only have assessed certain domains of learning. So again, we are using the Key Stage 2 results as an indicator of how good they are at English and Maths. But actually, if they've been asked different questions or on a different day, there would be some variation in that. We need to be mindful of that. And lastly, we also need to be open about the fact that the target grade is based on a best guess. It's a probability. It's what the statistical data is suggesting they are most likely to get. It is by no means a certainty. It doesn't mean that a pupil who is predicted a 7 will get to a 7, nor does it mean that he won't get to an 8 or a 9. So it's really important that we understand that and we talk openly about that. There's also a real lack of evidence of the impact on learning that target grades have. And many people will discuss impacts such as raising expectations, for example, or motivating pupils. And whilst there isn't a strong research or evidence base to prove the positive impacts that they have, there is a range of research which discusses the shortfalls of this and the negative impacts of this. So not only do we look at removing the GCSE target grades, but in the same vein, we also then took away the GCSE grading system being applied from year 7 to year 11. And the arguments for this are very similar. So the idea of being graded and having a target grade can really act as a barrier to learning for a number of reasons. And the research and the links that I share with you are a great place to delve into that in more detail. But in summary, grade orientation is inversely linked to intrinsic motivation. So effectively, the more that pupils are used to striving for a particular number, seeing that number on their piece of work, whether it's the number they want or the number that they don't want, it has an ongoing impact at eroding the levels of intrinsic motivation. And at the end of the day, we want our pupils to leave our school actually wanting to learn for learning's sake and not just for the sake of fixating on a certain set of targets. It also there's also evidence of the reduced quality in the depth of thought which takes place when you are grade oriented, basically. So you become fixated on getting to the next threshold and what you need to tick the next box, as opposed to genuinely getting deeper into that subject or that level of understanding. Because actually, you only need to do what you need to do to get to that number that you are being told you need to get to. And it also creates a preference for the easiest task. So again, it can impact motivation in a different way, because a pupil will very quickly realise the quickest way to get the teacher off their back or to get a reward of some kind. And if they can do enough just to get to that target, then that's enough. They don't need to do any more. So they will not necessarily then seek out extension tasks or harder tasks, because the message that they are being told is, this is what you should get, and you've got there. In the same vein, we also need to think about the impact that it has on pupils overall and the way in which we then interact with them as staff. So fixed views on intelligence or potential, which is what we're doing when we use target grades with pupils, we are saying to them, this is what you are capable of getting. Now, I know a lot of staff will say, well, we have discussions that that's a minimum expectation and we know that they can push forwards and things like that. And I understand that. And I think that that is valuable if you are working in a system where target grades are used. But actually, we still need to think about the impact on self-esteem of being told that you are going to get a 4, for example, when the rest of your class might be looking at something higher. It's also important to think about the self-esteem that comes with not meeting your targets, whatever that level of target might be. If you're consistently missing that target, what that can be saying about the level of failure that people perceive you to be engaging in. And we know that people switch off if they perceive perceive that they are not capable of getting to this number that they are being told that they need to have. So there's a lot to be said for self-esteem there. But it also affects expectations, firstly for the pupils themselves. We don't want it to be limiting like a glass ceiling for them, but also the expectations of staff. So when we are talking about pupils as being low prior attainment and having low target grades, we are saying something about that pupil. We're labelling that pupil. We're putting an expectation on that pupil. And whilst we might not consciously treat them differently, it's really, really difficult to overcome some unconscious biases. But there's also practices within school that you'll recognise which really kind of model this. So, for example, differentiation, the idea of using worksheets which are targeted at different target grades. Well, that's exactly what we're doing. We're limiting pupils if we're saying you're a 4 target, you need to complete this worksheet, whereas the person with a 6 target gets to complete a harder worksheet, which is more demanding. So we know that that is something which hopefully we're moving away from as a profession, but we know certainly has happened in the past and continues to happen. And we also get into conversations about setting, for example, and also access to the curriculum, which may happen. You might have reduced access to a curriculum if you are considered to not be capable of reaching a particular threshold. So we really need to be mindful of those aspects. And lastly, increased anxiety, similar to the idea of self-esteem, but for any kind of level, the anxiety which comes with not meeting a perceived target, and actually that this can lead to cheating, not just the anxiety, but actually if all that matters is reaching a particular number, then the easiest way to get there is by cheating. And again, it comes back to this idea of we want our pupils to be engaged in the learning for the learning's sake, as well as to get good results which help them go on to the next steps of their education. So the last point on the GCSE grading and targets is this idea that GCSE grades are not a progression model. And I've touched upon this before, but the flight path model particularly plays into this idea that we can somehow track the progress through GCSE grades and therefore targets from year 7 straight through to year 11. GCSEs are a 2-year course, and they look to assess the domains which are covered within that 2-year course. And to apply it to anything different is less meaningful and less useful, which is what we're aiming for in terms of the information we receive, meaningful and useful data. So in terms of how to plan and implement for these changes, it's really important to be mindful of the main concerns from others. And this assessment system, I said already, it's not perfect, and there are things that I would continue to change within this system, but I have to be mindful of the stakeholders within the system. I'm not making an assessment system just for myself because it would look different to how it looks now, but we have to be mindful of the stakeholders, parents, pupils, governors, teachers, etc. So some concerns that were raised were, how are the pupils going to know where they are going and where they are headed? How are we going to track and monitor? And it did come down to accountability, particularly above me. How are we going to ensure accountability and that we can pick up any issues as they arise in terms of the learning? And so overcoming these concerns was similar to before. It was really, really up to me to use the evidence and the research to show them that some of the preconceptions that we had been working under, the misconceptions I should say, were flawed, and also that there was better ways to do things. Also to link to wider approaches which were already in place that they had seemed to find successful and we were embedding successfully. So actually we've got a 3-year programme underway to embed metacognition within our school, and that was something which really linked well to what I was trying to achieve within this assessment system as well. An idea of a system which supported self-reflection, learning for learning's sake, always looking at how we could get better, how we could tool ourselves to continue to improve and not get stuck on target grades and grading systems. And it was really important that I provided a clear alternative, which I did and was presented, and then we moved from there. So here's the alternative that I presented. This is a snapshot of what it looks like from a reporting point of view. So we've got commitment to learning, which I won't go into in much detail now, but that's basically a summary of their behaviours for learning. And that already existed, that was kept. But the next 3 columns were new. So we now report an assessment percentage for the assessments that they have sat. So in the first data point 1, the pupil would get 56%, for example, on their English assessment. And that is what they will be told. No target, no grade, no idea of anything else surrounding that, just that assessment percentage being reported to them. Then, in terms of reporting, for parents and also for pupils as part of their report, we would try and give some context to that percentage with a cohort average. So that is just showing what the average percentage score within the cohort was, to give some context of where the individual pupil score sits, and also a previous percentage. And this percentage is there to give some form of an idea of trajectory and how that learning journey has been going and has been progressing. So immediately you'll see that some of those things don't entirely tie up with some of the research that we were talking about, because with a previous percentage, we are looking at offering that up as a indication of some kind of trajectory. And this is where it really comes to the forefront about needing to consider what different stakeholders need from an assessment system. And I'll talk more about that later. But this is the assessment system that we're moved forwards with. And I'm going to talk about some of the pros and cons of that. So percentages is a relatively simple system. It's universally understood mostly, and is actually a lot clearer to understand than any kind of conversion into GCSE grades and 3 pluses and 4 minuses and this pathway towards whatever their key stage 4 target is. So people can understand that 45% represents that they got 45% of the marks available on a particular assessment. It's also it's non-limiting, so it's not saying that you got this grade and you should have got this grade. The idea is you got 45%, so how are we going to move forwards to get the rest of the percentages that we need to move towards 100%? And this transition was also quite simple for us, because what a lot of our staff did already was mark a piece of work, find a percentage, and then convert that percentage into the GCSE grades that we were previously seeing. So there was some simplicity in the transition into an assessment system based on percentages. I've put there, it does what it says on the tin, and that's a little bit flippant of me, but I really am trying to get at there that it was representative of the percentage of the paper that the child was able to demonstrate that they had mastered up to that point. So whilst there's lots of conversation we could have about validity and reliability, that's not what I'm getting into here. What I'm getting into is that it is a clear representation of something, and in this case it's the marks that they gained on that paper. And lastly, it really feeds into what I'm trying to get at with the idea of a growth mindset. So not limiting pupils and trying to create a dialogue around, this is what you've got on this assessment. It's not who you are. It's not what you are limited to. This is a process where we're going to continually just try and get better percentages as we move throughout our learning journey throughout our school. Now, the average percentage score gives a reference point, like I talked about, and it was really clear from the parental feedback when I first talked to them about what was wrong with the initial system, what they liked about the initial system and what was wrong with it, and equally what they would look for in a new system. They were very, very clear that they wanted some kind of reference point about how their child was doing. And whilst I do want to move away from a system which is focused on comparing myself to the pupil sat next to me, because again, I want them to grow into a system where they are improving for their own intrinsic motivation. It was important that was very clear from parents as to what they wanted. And the same is similar with the previous percentage score. That's another thing we wanted to give the parents in terms of an idea of their learning journey. However, we do make it very, very clear in the communication that we do not expect the progress to be linear. Please don't think that your child has necessarily got worse because that percentage is lower. It's a reference point, but there are lots of reasons why that might not just incrementally get better every time. And the average percentage score does give us some capacity to identify pupils for some form of support as well. We can see who is way below that average. Now, some flaws with the system: just because the percentage is there doesn't mean it's right. It doesn't mean that it is accurate. It is not possible to have an accurate score per se, because all assessment is it has inherent flaws within it. But it means that it is meaningful in the context of what we are using it for. However, the meaningfulness, to make a new word, is still very much dependent on other flaws in an assessment system, such as subjective grade descriptions, mark schemes, markers, intra-marker reliability, things like that. So again, we're not saying that this is a perfect system, it's just the representation that we're choosing to use for a number of reasons based on some of the previous slides. Some concerns around the average percentage score is the impact both on the lowest current attainers and the highest. So the highest attainers, it can give a false sense of I've done it, I've met the reference point. So if the only reference point they have is the average, we've got to be cautious that they don't just think, great, I was better than that, so I don't need to work any harder. And equally, for pupils who are consistently seeing themselves well below the average percentage, we need to be mindful of that. And we've had feedback from parents on that as well. And that comes into having a conversation around actually how we frame that dialogue with pupils about, this is the assessment score you got, but this is what we're going to do to improve it, and we're going to support you to do that. It also doesn't give an idea of the spread of the data. Now, we can access that information behind the scenes, but it is just something that is not represented there. We don't know how much the average has been skewed by outliers initially. And lastly, with the previous percentage score, as I said, it plays into this idea of progress being linear slightly. So we've got to be really cautious of making it clear that that is not what we are expecting from pupils. But it also doesn't necessarily account for the discrete nature of certain units or skills. So we particularly see this in science, for example, where we might actually be comparing two percentage scores which are on completely different subjects, effectively looking at physics and then a chemistry unit, where we wouldn't necessarily expect it to be completely transferable. So we would expect to see differences in those percentage scores potentially. But again, it's about communicating that with parents and making that clear to pupils and parents. And another ongoing kind of point for discussion is whether the percentage should be cumulative or a snapshot. So do we want it to represent all of the assessments up until any given data points? Or do we want it to be a snapshot? They sat one assessment and this is what they got. Now, we chose to go down a cumulative route because I want to give that broader consideration of all of the different assessment types and practices that have gone into giving us an idea of a representation of where that pupil is. But you could argue that either way, and it's something that we'll continue to look at in the future. So behind the scenes, I'm then in a position where I need to have a tracking and monitoring system. And this is where it comes into, again, thinking about the stakeholders. So I was able to make the changes on the ground, as it were, in the way that we interact with pupils to do with their assessment scores. But I needed to still fulfil the requirement from stakeholders about tracking and monitoring systems behind the scenes. So the system that I chose to use was a percentile system. And this is cohort referenced, where pupils are ranked by their attainment from top to bottom. So when they do any kind of assessment, you'll take the top performing pupil by score percentage and then rank from top to bottom. So this is expressed as a number between 1 and 99. That's the percentiles. And basically, the bigger the number, the better the rank, the better they did. So the 50th percentile means that they were better than 50% of the cohort, but worse than 50% of the cohort, whilst a 99th percentile means they did better than 99% of all the other pupils. And we use this to give us some kind of reference points about how well the pupils are doing. Now, this is important to say that this is internal only. It's not shared in any way with parents or pupils. So we get to a position where we can create subject analysis. So to begin with, pupils are given a target percentile based on their Key Stage 2 data. So straight away, you'll also see slight incongruence with some of the things I was saying about target grades and then including a similar approach in this system. And I completely accept that, and I'm not ignorant of that. But we have to serve dual purposes here. So they are given a target percentile based on their Key Stage 2 data. So effectively what that means is their Key Stage 2 data is then ranked from top to bottom. So we have the people who attain the highest down to the lowest. So they have kind of a target score for maths, English, and then we do an other to account for non-English and maths subjects, which are based on an average of the two. So you can see here an example. With English, we have a target percentile here, and I've just cut and pasted some so that we can see a range on the screen, but they've got their target percentile. And what we do then is they sit the assessment, and based on their performance within that assessment, they are then ranked again. So we see their ranking based on a specific assessment. And then it comes to just working out the difference between those rankings. So we're seeing how far away they are from where they should, in inverted commas, be within the cohort. And whilst the thresholds for concern, as it were, or to flag up for something that we need to look at, whether we can offer support if there's a particular issue, etc., those thresholds will vary with each cohort. But I went up in centile basically, so in tens, and I used the cutoff as being -10. So anything that was -10 or better, I left alone, and we looked at -11 downwards as being somewhere where they were starting to get a bit far away from their target. Now, that can be completely dependent on the cohort, and even within subjects that changed quite drastically. So that's a fluid measure, but it allows us to have some kind of RAG rating, and that allows us to just get an idea of where kids are working slightly further away than where we would expect them to be working based on what their Key Stage 2 data tells us. This then can be used for whole school analysis by really applying the same strategy, but combining all of their percentiles and working out an average. So work out their average target percentile across English, maths, other, and then we have all of their scores, and then we look at the average percentile rank across all subjects, and then the residual difference again. So it's exactly the same process, but for the next level up, it allows me to identify that across whole school data, looking at patterns and trends, identifying pupil groups, and looking if there are particular pupils that we want to give more support to on a whole school level rather than just a departmental level itself. And it also does allow us to then report that to stakeholders such as governors and within the trust. It also allows us to produce a range of data. I won't go into this in too much detail, but just as some examples, you can have whole school summaries where you're looking at pupils who are meeting that -9 upwards threshold. So we're thinking that they are doing okay or better than their percentile target. And it also allows us to do a similar thing at a subject level, where you could make those thresholds anything that you like and just report percentages and numbers of pupils who are falling within certain categories. And again, gives us percentages across the different data points, so we can track that figure over time. So pros and cons of percentile ranks. Many of them will be points which I've already made, so I won't labour on those, but I do want to just highlight that we're aware of them and conscious of them. So the percentile rank, again, used quite flippantly, saying it does what it says on the tin. It is a ranking system, and so it looks at attainment from top to bottom. And I think there is value in that, in being able to identify pupils who may need further support, either because they're further from target or because they are simply in a lower percentile. And there's also some value in it, in the sense that it is somewhat similar to the process that would be used in allocating GCSE grades, where there is no magic, raw score which gets you a 7 or a 6 or a 5, for example. The idea is we have all of the data, we look at the distribution of that data, and then they allocate grade boundaries based on the proportion of pupils at each level, and that is done on a ranking system as well. So there's some value in that there. By comparing with target percentiles, we are able to identify pupils for support, and it takes into account prior attainment, which you could argue as a positive or a negative based on what I've said already. It's easy to calculate, and it's really important to raise at this point that it's not shared with the pupils and the parents. So whilst I can understand some of the incongruence between what I'm saying and what I'm showing now, because we have to have a multi-purpose system, I am confident that what we have now is better than what we had before, because we don't have target grades and GCSE grading on their work. What the pupils experience is very different in terms of the percentages, and this is working behind the scenes. And the average percentile comparison allows us to build a profile of each pupil and then allows us to inform next steps. Now, some of the negatives of the percentile rankings, it's still based on Key Stage 2 data. So all of the criticisms I had of target grades to do with Key Stage 2 data still stand. And it also, and I think most importantly, gives teachers the idea of this potential, which we were trying to avoid. So there does need to, again, be close monitoring of that, and also dialogue with staff about not allowing that to limit our expectations. And that's easier said than done. And there's definitely an argument for potentially not sharing that information at all, but that in itself brings other issues with it. Again, that's probably a conversation to have with anyone who's interested in having it separately. But I do want to make everyone aware that, you know, that is a flaw in the system. If we're talking about expectations from staff and unconscious bias, perhaps, this system still doesn't mitigate that. And lastly, there is an overconfidence with national representation, because actually you're very unlikely to have a completely nationally representative cohort within your school, particularly if you've got a small cohort. So we can't give too much kind of power to that idea of it being similar to the GCSE grade allocation. Comparison with target grades, target percentiles, really it's back to the idea of the issues with target grades. But one of the other things is that moving up is dependent on someone else moving down. So the very nature of a ranking system means that in order to move up, someone else has to get better. So if everybody got better by the same amount, it would mask that within the rankings, because everyone would stay exactly the same rank, even though they had all got better. So that's something to be mindful of. And lastly, with average percentile comparisons, or for any of this really, we've got to remember that the movement between different percentiles is not the same. It's not like an interval scale where, you know, moving from 50 to 51 is the same as moving from 80 to 81. There is different kind of constraints to that. So we need to be mindful that it's not a truly step-by-step system. So in terms of the planning and implementation of this, like I said, we had a parent survey which heavily informed my thinking on what this system needed to be able to do. And we had a whole staff session where I unveiled my proposal and I took feedback on that straight away initially. And we also set up a working group where there was 4 meetings, 2 groups who met twice, and really got into it and discussed the pros and cons of the different systems. And then there was later some opportunities for heads of department to feedback if people felt like they had missed anything or didn't want to come to the group but wanted to contribute. And what I'm really proud of is to show this, because in the top right hand corner you'll see something which actually looks different to what I've shown you was the finished product. And that is really testament to the level of collaboration and the engagement with this process from our staff, our incredible staff, because this in the top right hand corner was what I suggested originally, to use percentiles and percentile comparisons with the pupils and to use that with parents and to report. And I think the planning and implementation of this was really important, because it stopped me, or it took me out of the point of creating an assessment system which I felt tracked and monitored to a much greater degree of accuracy. So I was really pleased in terms of what I think the assessment system was doing in terms of creating meaningful and useful data. But actually, in doing that, I needed to be more considerate of different stakeholders, what parents would want, what parents would feel about percentile rankings, how it would impact things like self-esteem and motivation of pupils. And it was a brilliant way of moderating that system down. So we ended up with the system I've just presented to you, whereby the language and the data, the information that we use with pupils is the percentage system. We have this percentile in the background running, which helps to support in exactly the same way I had planned it to, but it didn't need to be shared immediately in that format. And the other thing in terms of planning for this change, once we had that kind of agreement on the system, once we had that real ownership of it being our assessment system, not just something I'd come up with after reading all the research and books and journals, etc., there was a real sense of ownership about it being our new system. And in order to drive that forwards, we also had some dialogue about where departments needed support, whether that be in time or just to have a discussion about how to move their assessments onto a percentage-based system. So making sure that everything was ready before we got back in September to put that into place. There's also some operational considerations that I would strongly recommend you think about. So for us, it required changing our Go for School setup in the way that data is input, and also our reporting systems, which took a really long time to formalise and to set up and to get going. So planning that time into your kind of both planning and implementation stage. Our data analysis system, making sure we had something that was up and running, and we chose to actually work on Excel because we found it the most flexible system to use. But looking into those systems, and are people skilled enough to use those systems? And also small things which make a big impact. So for example, we had progress stickers on the front of every child's book which had their target grade and then a box to fill in their grades as they got their assessments back. And small things, but we needed to not order any more of those, and actually I changed the template for those to be more inclusive and more representative of what we wanted pupils to get out of dialogue about percentages in this case. So just little things like that you might not necessarily think of straight away, but are important to bear in mind. It's also really, really important to communicate the change and the rationale to parents. Now, this had already been started with the dialogue from the surveys, and it was nice to be able to say, we've listened to your feedback, we've listened to what what you've been saying you want from this and how it can be improved, and we've come up with this system. We're going to trial it for a year, and then we'll come back and get your feedback after the event. And also making sure that people were clear about what they were reading. So actually being able to interpret the data and use that data to get some level of understanding about what we're trying to tell them about their child. And also really important to communicate the change with pupils. And I think if I could go back and do the implementation stage again, that's the bit I would change the most, because I think that we informed the pupils about the changes, but I think there was more mileage in really explaining why we're making that change to lay the groundwork for that movement towards the dialogue we then had with them in September around growth mindset and, okay, this is what the percentage means, this is what we do with that information, this is how we keep moving forwards. I think some work could have been done with the pupils to kind of prepare them for that in advance. I think that's where I'd go back and change some things. So in terms of evaluation, I've talked through a lot of different ways that we got evaluation through the planning process and also the implementation process. Now that's been halted slightly by COVID because although we've been able to gather a lot of the things that are on the slide there, the thing that I really wanted to do, which I haven't been able to and we'll have to do at another date, is the idea of pupil voice and a focus group to really get to the bottom of whether this has had any impact on the way pupils perceive themselves and their academic progress and their attainment and their learning journey. First of all, to ask them very explicitly about the system, what they think of it, pros and cons, etc., but also to ask more probing questions which might uncover some more things about that level of self-regulation and the thought process that are going through their head when they receive a percentage score, for example. And this is going to build into a wider evaluation of this implementation of metacognition on a wider level within the school, because we're at a point where we know the systems are in place, but are the pupils actually internalising that and benefiting from that in the way that we want them to be? So overall, what I can say so far is that teaching staff and HODs have been extremely positive about it, and the stakeholders above me in terms of governors and the trust have also been very positive about it. Feedback from parents very positive too, but as I did mention earlier, there is conversations being had with parents where they are where the child is low attaining on either a particular assessment or regularly on assessments, and how this is impacting them when they think about their comparison to the average. So that's really important to have a dialogue with them about that, because whenever you have any kind of cohort reference, then pupils are always going to feel that way. And a lot of the conversation has been actually the old system had that in it as well. It doesn't mean that that's necessarily a reason to keep it, but we're hoping that the other changes we've made within this system will help to support this idea of pushing forwards and continual growth, as opposed to the added having that comparison and then having the added pressure of a target grade and some kind of cap to your potential. And an interesting bit of feedback is hyper attaining pupils. There's been some moaning and some feedback about that, where pupils feel a little bit lost. Those pupils who were previously used to being told how much better they were doing than everybody else aren't being told that anymore. And I think that's a positive thing, and that's not something I want to change, but it's worth raising. And it's also important to have dialogue with the pupils about why that is a change that we have chosen to make, as opposed to just something that's accidentally happened. So thoughts for the future then, things that I would either want to change or to consider. The role of GCSE targets at Key Stage 4. There is a lot of tension between what is good for their learning, but also being able to support them in knowing where they are in terms of a GCSE grade, in order to support them with applications and post-16 choices, which are obviously important for them to do. And also there is that tension between accountability at Key Stage 4, which is so much higher than Key Stage 3. Looking to reduce data points further, so we got 6 down to 3. Actually, if we went down to a smaller number of data points, what would be the opportunity costs there, and what would be the benefits to making data more meaningful? Whether or not to share percentiles with pupils, whether to go towards a model which does share that information. There's something that is more widespread in America, but there are schools in the UK that do that too, and you can see some of those on my references as well, but some interesting food for thought. So here's just a summary, exactly the same slide as I showed you before, but this just kind of now shows it all on one screen after you've now talked through it. And I would just say that any of these systems, any of these changes on their own are not going to just revolutionize the system. It is about how they all tie in with your school culture, with the conversations that happen day to day in classroom level, what is modelled by leaders, what is modelled by every member of staff in the school, and it all ties into a much bigger system. But hopefully this talk gives you an idea of some changes that you could make, and even if you don't want to make those changes, maybe make you more informed about some of the things that you might have in place and whether or not they could be more efficient. I'll come back to that quote in a second. Here is just references. I know you'll be able to pause the screen and have a look at those properly. But the ones in white are ones which have been included in the slides, and then ones down the bottom are important to me because they've informed my thinking so much, but aren't directly linked to a quote, for example, in the slide. And so when I finish on this quote here, I'd just like to say thanks very much for listening, and please get in touch with me if you'd like to discuss this any further. If you'd like any support, if you'd like me to send you any of my documents or my proposal, for example, for you to potentially use as a start point. And equally, if you think there are better ways, and I know that I'm aware of ways in which we can improve this system further, but I'm always open to hear more about them and discuss them, and also look at other approaches that other schools use to see if we can improve our own system or have another trail of thought on that. So please do get in touch. Please give me some feedback about that. It'll be really, really useful to just continue that dialogue about assessment at whole school level.